Well, welcome to the closing plenary of the Public Education Network's 1997 Annual Conference. The Public Education Network, as all of you know, is a national association that works to improve the effectiveness of America's public schools. We are in 26 states, 84 communities, and we impact the lives of 1 out of every 10 children that goes to K-12 public school in the country. It's an amazing statistic, and you do that work, and we're proud of you, and we thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Carol Gilligan and Dr. Cornel West, who will lead the closing plenary session by reflecting on their work in gender and race and the implications that that work has on our society and public education. Moderating today's panel is John Merrow of the Merrow Reports. After the presentation, our presenters have generously agreed to take questions, so please use the microphones that have been set up around the room so that all of us can hear your questions. I also want to say that this session has been generously underwritten by Sears Roebuck and Company. You'll notice that the TV cameras are stationed around the room. C-SPAN is broadcasting today's session live, and we are grateful to them for helping us to share the important message of the Public Education Network's annual conference on gender, race, and student achievement. It will go around the country and hopefully worldwide. It is also being recorded for John Merrow's NPR series, The Merrow Report. And we will let you know what places that you'll be able to hear that around the country. Before I introduce Dr. Gilligan and Dr. West, I want to take a moment to share why we chose to close this conference with the perspective of 2 of America's leading intellectuals. One of the purposes of academia is to serve as a hothouse for ideas and political thought, which in turn are used to shift public consciousness. Václav Havel said that consciousness comes before being, and this conference is about shifting public consciousness and awareness of the ways in which gender and race impact student achievement. We turn to Dr. West and Dr. Gilligan to put our conference in a larger context. A historical context of struggle, of resistance, of sacrifice for the greater public good. It is making such connections between what we face now and what has previously transpired that we discover the deeply embedded capacities, gifts, and skills of our children. Therefore, we have beseeched Dr. Gilligan and Dr. West to help us rightfully and mightily place this struggle at the center of our work. Doing so, I truly believe, will help us to understand what has come before and what may follow, so that we may leave behind a better understanding of why we struggle so dynamically for fairness, equity, and tolerance. Here today to moderate today's discussion is John Merrow, of the much-hailed series that has appeared on PBS and the National Public Radio called The Merrow Report. Many of you have seen on TV or at the Penn video station the 2-part series that chronicled the battles of David Hornbeck, Penn's board chair and Philadelphia's superintendent of schools. Before editing, hosting, writing, and producing his own show, John Merrow brought us Learning Matters on the Learning Channel. Options on Education, on National Public Radio, and the Emmy Award-winning series, Your Children, Our Children. Mr. Merrow was for 5 years the chief education correspondent for the McNeil-Lira NewsHour. I thank him for joining us today. Carol Gilligan and Cornel West are dear friends to the Public Education Network. Carol Gilligan is a professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she is the first holder of the Patricia Graham Chair for Gender Studies at Harvard Graduate School of Education. She She has been on the front line of education reform by creating prevention projects for girls and boys and advocating for special education and psychological needs of girls and boys. This history of involvement even precedes the writing of In a Different Voice, her award-winning and groundbreaking study of the unique moral and psychological growth of females. Her research has blended women's voices into previously inaccessible canons of psychological theory, human development, gender, and racial studies. Her championing of voice-centered method of research that she has developed has profoundly impacted all of the social sciences. She is also a friend. I was there at her installation of the chair at Harvard, and I was there because she is my friend and because I love her. I also feel very honored to stand before you with the privilege of introducing a man who's been instrumental in changing my views about race and the ways in which I think about it. Dr. Cornel West is professor of Afro-American Studies and Philosophy of Religion at Harvard University. He came to Harvard from Princeton, where he revamped the Department of Afro-American Studies to nationwide acclaim and praise. He is the author of the best-selling book, Race Matters. Dr. West has centered his recent work on the goal of creating a politics of meaning. The goal of this endeavor, he has written, is to change the bottom in American society so that the productivity or efficiency of corporations, legislation, or social practices is not wealth and power, but also the degree to which they tend to maximize capacities to sustain loving and caring relationships and to be ethically, spiritually, and ecologically sensitive. We are privileged today to have two people who have brought their intellect to the power and spirit of human action. The plenary is now open.
I think we should applaud these people. I'd like to start. I'd actually like to start. It's an honor to be here with you both. And one of the things that you do when you are interviewing is you ask your, usually young girls, to finish sentences. I'm taking a sentence from your questionnaire. I'd like each of you to finish the sentence. What gets me into trouble is...
I'm going to take my cue from girls. The end of that sentence is my big mouth.
Dr. West, what gets me into trouble is...
I want to give the tag of the girls is, which is, but it's usually worth it.
Can you top that?
Gets me into trouble is trying to be honest and candid without being offensive.
And is that possible?
It's a thin line, but it's certainly possible.
Who do you get in trouble with?
Oh, a variety of different persons and constituencies. Because when you tell the truth, it hurts yourself as well. The truth hurts you as well as others. Truth is a terrifying thing.
But you're not stopping.
Oh, not at all. And it's partly because, you see, I'm a product of public schools, where I acquired a passion of the mind to know before I die. And that's education in the most beautiful and desperate sense. How do we engage in this rich quest for wisdom that includes deep self-criticism on the one hand, but also connected with a cause bigger and grander than us?
Now, you tend to look at things through the lens of race, you through the lens of gender. Now, I don't want to pigeonhole you, but tell me how these twin issues are related.
You start.
Well, really, I think as a black man, as a citizen, and as a human being, I want to begin with gender. Because it seems to me that we cannot talk about any particular evil in America, be it white supremacy, male supremacy, be it vast economic inequality, homophobia, be it losing sight of the humanity of the physically challenged, and so on, without noting how they're intertwined. And so to talk about gender for me is so very important, because I know on the one hand that in growing up there was a deep male supremacy in me. I was socialized in that way. And it was through this same passion of the mind, through education in the deepest sense, that I had to criticize and call into question the kinds of prejudices and prejudgments that I had as a man, actually a man who had access to certain kind of male privilege. And so even given my critique of racism and white supremacy, I knew that I had to be able to weave it together in male supremacy. And I should also say that the example of my mother as such an autonomous and self-assertive and self-confident and elegant person.
When did you start becoming aware of that male supremacy being...
I think it was early on in watching my mother, who was a first grade teacher in public school and the principal of a public school, to see her sense of not just taking control, but fusing the compassion on the one hand with the...
But early on means 15,
early on
20?
Means, well, I'll tell
10?
you, earlier than that, actually. Probably about 6 or 7 when she actually began working. Now, the ideological, which is to say the kind of intellectual framework, I acquired both from her and then Bell Hooks and Paula Gittins and Angela Davis and Carol Gilligan and a host of others.
Your answer? How are they connected? Dr. West says gender comes first. He didn't tell us how they're intertwined, so you can do that.
Well, we're trying to show you how they're intertwined. Because I'm going to talk about race.
There you go.
And I thought of myself, I think of myself, have thought of myself for a long time as a woman, also as a Jew, growing up during the Holocaust. And so for me, for a long time, that was the meaning of race. And it took me a long time to begin to think of myself as white and to think of myself as privileged by virtue of being white in this society. Because I had otherwise, as a woman and as a Jew, had not seen myself in that kind of position or in a privileged position. So it was really later that I came to be aware of how being white in this society allows me to be unaware of race. I mean, in a sense, how race becomes invisible for me as a white woman until I become aware of my whiteness. And then I see race just in the ways in which I can walk through this society myself in a sense, without experiencing what I know from my friends, from my reading of Cornel, from my reading of Toni Morrison, from my reading of
Your whiteness protects you. You don't have to see.
Well, but I'm just saying that race means whiteness. Yeah. Race means whiteness, that when I think of race, I have to think of myself as a white woman whereas I'm privileged by virtue of that whiteness, and then I think about how race just corrodes our society and divides us.
Let me suggest...
And then we have to talk about social class.
Yeah. Let me suggest that most white people don't do that. We just accept our whiteness. So how did it happen to you that you started thinking of yourself?
Well, I have to say, when I was in college, it was during the Civil Rights Movement, and I remember outside the dining room of college there would be this sign-up sheet if you wanted to become involved in the busing. And, you know, going and doing voter registration. So, I mean, my awareness came at that point where I remember going door to door, you know, doing voter registration and, you know, sitting and realizing the importance of having an articulate, you know, active, politically active black voice in this culture, you know, to break what had been a silence and an unawareness.
Are you suggesting, though, that for you, race, you know, it's like rock, paper, scissors, race is higher up in the list than gender?
Well, I think we got to talk about archies, patriarchy. I mean, I don't think that the question is the hierarchy. To me, they are absolutely intertwined. I mean, if I identify myself by gender, I identify myself by race, and I think the sense of trying to bring them apart and make one more important, privilege one over the other, has led to a division which has really, in some sense, limited both conversations.
But isn't that the way it usually works? You've got to choose, you've got to limit it? I mean,
this is part of the problem, though. You see, that we have to broaden our imaginations in such a way that we're able to see the complexity and the different levels. So it's not either or, as it were. We know, for example, that class, economic inequality, is fundamental. We know that racism is fundamental. We know that Patriarchy is fundamental. They are related not just in the lives of women, especially women of color, in terms of it all being enacted in their existential experience, but in terms of understanding the history of America and the present of America. We cannot engage in a choosing, and we cannot certainly engage in this kind of algebra of blood of which group has caught the most hail and so forth. But it's just acknowledging that as human beings we have a passion for those who have been mistreated, and we have to keep track of power, resources,
okay,
status.
Let me put you in a position then. I'm a foundation person. I've got money to make a big grant to either you or both of you, but I only have enough money to either take care of all the girls, black and white and Latina, right, or all the African Americans.
But you see, you don't have two separate categories.
So what are you going to do? You just,
I mean, all the girls include black girls, and all the African Americans include
boys and girls.
Yeah, right. So I mean, that's exactly the point.
What do you say to me? What do you say? I've got all the big bucks. What do you say to me? You don't want my money?
How did you end up with the big bucks?
Fair question. It's a patriarchy, and you know, there we go. What are you going to do? Oh, but that's often the way it works, isn't that true? So how do you educate me?
Well, then you have to get practical. You have to get practical. So, well, you can't define reality based on your access to foundation giving and so forth. But on the other hand, I would say that I would want to look at those various groups and see what kind of access to resources they have. And if it looks as if the black men have less or the black people have less vis-a-vis the others, then at that particular instant, I would take your money gladly, give it to this particular group, and ensure that these other groups also have access to resources, though it may not come directly from you.
Okay.
But if I felt that, in fact, if I were looking toward social change and the kind we're all agreeing on, or kind of working through the schools to make social change, and I felt, as I feel, that the voices of girls and the voices of girls and women initiate a process of change that is truly transforming, then I might take your dollars and give them to girls, because I would want to sustain and encourage and develop that courageous voice of girls, knowing that that will go into all families. And so in a way, I think it's such a powerful avenue for, you know, profound change in the way we love and work in our society, that I would want you to give your money to girls.
So you would take the money and do the right thing. You would say the right words and take the money. There's a lesson in there. Does this happen?
What?
Do people push you to choose the way I just tried to?
Oh, sure. All the time. All the time.
Well, and it's ironic, too, because to push the choice, you start to not see reality. You start to not see that women include women of color, and you start to not see that even gender issues are alive in the black community.
Mm-hmm. Or another way, I mean, I think the attempt to keep track of the complex realities as opposed to choosing between categories. You see, part of the problem in American culture is that we tend to want to view the world through a set of very abstract categories and never really get to the messy reality that these categories are supposed to refer to. And I think what Sister Carol is doing, Professor Gilligan is doing, is saying, look, the reality is there. We know we have to use some categories, but we cannot fetishize these categories and then think that we're simply choosing one over the other. Because if you choose one, you're missing so much of the reality, the suffering, the pain, the sorrow, and sadness that's out there. And therefore the question becomes, how do we use our categories in such a way that they are subservient to keeping track of the complex reality? That's why class, that's why sexual orientation, that's why physically challenged are as important.
But I also think, too, that you know, it's true that in life we have to make difficult choices. I mean, that's what you're saying. And it's important when we make difficult choices, I think, to stay with the difficulty of the choice and not try to rationalize the difficulty by saying somehow what I've chosen is the better thing. So when you choose where you're going to allocate your resources, it's important to keep in mind the importance of where you don't give your money. And then I have to say, you know, just politically, that to set race against gender, I mean, in a certain way, you can say, you know, whose interest does this serve? And it doesn't serve the interest of men and women, and it doesn't serve the interest of black and white people.
One of the things that both of you are noted for is your ability to avoid demonizing. And you identify problems, but you don't say, well, those are if we could just get rid of those guys. Talk to me a little bit about that question of avoiding, because it seems to me a lot of the society does demonize. Well, it's really, that's the bad guy. How do you do that?
Well, you know, my work, I work by listening to people's voices, and I really think if you listen to people's voices, you take in their voices and you try to, you know, in a sense, you come into where they are and where they're speaking from. You can't, you know, you can't demonize them. I mean, you can understand in a way how they came at this particular time, you know, to hold the position they hold. And I mean, I feel for my own work, which has been listening to girls and women, it has opened up the human world in a way that was, you know, just, it was a revelation in some ways to me, to realize how much the human world was not carrying women and girls' voices. That's half the human population whose experience was not being shared, was not available. And it just raises, it's a window, an avenue also into the experiences of boys and men. So it doesn't occur to me that it would be, in that sense,
It is interesting. In your book, you don't, I mean, you point out how the questions were written by men and asked of boys often and then generalized, but you don't do it in such a way that puts people...
Well, I don't feel that way. I mean, it's also not my history. It's not my life. I mean, not growing up, I not only was my father, but my father's father, who was one of the, so I in a way had, you know, two very loving fathers in my childhood. And then I live with a man, my husband. I have 3 sons. I mean, this
You'd
is
be
what...
in trouble if you studied.
I'd have to have a different life.
I think part of it has to do with acknowledging that education is not simply about skills, but it's about this quest for wisdom. And it's often said, wisdom enters not into the malicious heart, and knowledge without conscience is but the ruin of the soul, which is to say there has to be a relation between this very terrifying quest for wisdom on the one hand and the humbling quest for compassion on the other that trumps and forecloses and precludes all demonizing. Now that's difficult. It's easier said than done. But I think that we've tried to keep track of the humanity of others. Why? Because we're radical Democrats, small d. Which means we know we're going to live in a society with a whole host of persons who have very different views, different perspectives, and what have you. And at times it's going to sound like nonsense. And we know there will be moments in which what we say sounds like nonsense.
Now,
we want
in
to
your
be given
book,
the benefit of the doubt.
In Race Matters, you take some shots at different parts of the black community.
That's called truth-telling.
That's called truth.
Yes,
When you talk about, you know, black...
I think that's really interesting. I mean, to tell the truth without demonizing, it seems to me that should be the goal of our education, that we want children to tell the truth. I think the notion that somehow you help people or you create a better world by lying, I mean, psychologically, lies make people sick. I really deeply believe that. And so if we can educate, if we can all learn how we can strive for the truth and tell the truth without demonizing the other person, because that's not true either. I mean, the other person isn't a demon.
And some of it we do to ourselves. Women do it to themselves, blacks do it to themselves. You write in Race Matters how blacks view themselves through the white lens, and use the example of Michael Jackson, a very talented entertainer, though, who has made himself whiter. Do girls do that? Do girls view themselves through the lens of boys or
Oh, absolutely.
society?
I mean, we followed girls as they come to adolescence, their gaze goes right out and they start to, I mean, typical phrase, look at their looks. I mean, you know, they start to look at themselves and modulate their voices as they listen to what they can say without people calling them all the names that girls get called if they say what you know, people don't like girls to say, like too loud or rude or whatever. So women have been educated to be selfless, which is an incredible term, selfless without a self. And that means selfless, they become colonized, really, because then you take in, you know, you somehow put yourself, swallow yourself, usually hold it deep within yourself for some time. It's why women have a lot of hope. That self is held within ourselves, that sometime there'll be some place someone will listen and you can bring that out. Meanwhile, you function as if you were selfless. But the amazing thing about girls is they describe this move. They describe exactly why would you do that. And what they do is they all swallow, in a way for safekeeping, the parts of themselves that they most love and value, because they don't want to take it into a world where it will be invalidated or called stupid or called bad, or where they will feel somehow that they are being hurtful or destructive if they basically speak their minds and hearts. So you can, girls say, I mean, in a sense, girls look to women and men. It's an incredible opportunity for education, for really deep public education. Girls say at adolescence, this is what I'm seeing, what shall I do? I'm asked to move from authentic into inauthentic relationship, and that's called loving, or that's called good. So yes, that's what happens is, and then of course, you know you've done this to yourself, and you know why, in a sense, girls also can describe this incredibly, as one girl called it, brilliant strategy. That if I keep myself out of my relationship, so whenever anybody says to me, whatever hurtful things, I mean, whether it's raced or gendered or homophobic or about disability, it's not really about me because I'm not really there.
What's the cost of doing that?
Well, I think the cost is to democracy. I mean, we have a citizenry that's absent, that's not present as active citizens, and there's a cost for the whole country. It's not a democratic society if women aren't present with our voices. And then there's a cost everywhere down. There's a cost to the woman herself or to the girl. There's a cost to families, because women are still raising children in this country. If you have an absent person raising a child, you know, maybe sort of her body's there, but she's somewhere else, because again, mothers are told they should be selfless or should be like mirrors to children. Well, you can't have a relationship with a mirror. And children know this. So children keep reaching out to women, which is one of the most amazing thing about children, is they keep giving us adults chances over and over again. Yeah. So, that's why this public education network is really responding to that.
Dr. West, how does it play out among black people if you're viewing yourself through the lens? How does it work?
Well, on the one hand, it can result in levels of self-hatred and self-loathing that become self-destructive. Now, at that point, it's not just a matter of viewing yourself through others' lens, but not being able to conceive of alternatives, not being able to conceive of other options, as it were. I mean, we have a history of a deeply white supremacist civilization in America. And that civilization permeated every nook and cranny, every institution, and it attempted to convince people of color in general, and black people in particular, to think of themselves as less than human. And that takes a lot of energy, and it's hard to sustain a democracy, and that was part of the problem. It almost came to an end in the Civil War. And thank God that there were people of all colors, though a black-led movement in the 60s that opened up these possibilities so that we gain a self-confidence, a sense of self, of dignity and integrity, and a sense of taking control of one's own destiny, as it were.
But you said in Race Matters, many black nationalists are obsessed with white racism. That's the same lens problem, isn't it? Just a flip side of it?
Yes, but there's obsession and there's obsession. There's an obsession that wants to keep track of it, and there's an obsession that wants to simply flip it over and simply do the same thing to others, which is just as wrong and just as immoral. There are some black nationalists who don't flip it over at all, and therefore are concerned primarily about self-respect and black self-determination. And that's true for any nationalist. American nationalists, Italian nationalists, German nationalists. You've got chauvinistic versions, and you've got more moderate versions, and you have more democratic versions. But I think the real challenge for us, especially on an organization such as Public Education Network, who are really the salt of the earth because they're holding up the bloodstained banner of public education at a time in which it's being trashed. How do you generate the conditions for self-confidence, a sense of passion and excitement about the life of the mind in our market culture that puts such low priority on children, and especially children in chocolate cities?
Let's be concrete. I'm an education reporter. A lot of times will hear kids talking about black kids, African American kids, Latino kids. You're acting white. Right. That's a manifestation of what you're talking about?
That is internalized white supremacist perception.
And what do you say? Right. What do you say to a young black male or female who uses that expression?
I tell them, who told you that that's hip? Don't you know that W.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, they are hip. They are what's happening. And what you think is hip is in part a corporate construction of reality that you get on television, and therefore you internalize that view rather than finding out that the real hip folk, black, white, or whatever, are the loving, compassionate ones who are willing to live and die for a cause bigger than them. Now they may look at me and say, well, strange brother. But I said, but there's a whole tradition of understanding what it is to be hip, as opposed to defining hip over against quest for excellence, intellectual.
Now, you can't talk to every young black man and woman, so let's play it out in the schools. I mean, that's a real problem.
Oh, yeah.
Underachievement. So how do you change the schools?
But it's an American problem. I mean, it's not just a black problem.
That's true.
Right. It's an American problem. Yeah. We live in a business civilization. It's always been fearful of the intellect and always been degrading of women's intelligence and black and brown and red and yellow's intelligence.
So the solution wouldn't be race-based? The solution would be to combat anti-intellectualism generally?
It's got to be public-based. It's got to be public-based because race is inseparable from the future of American democracy, the prospects of the American Republic, and therefore public education has to be at the center. Now, it must wrestle with race and gender and class and so forth.
Maybe that's a way to keep the two intertwined, not use either term. Say, we're talking about all children. Talking about, I mean, I'm just...
Well, if we're talking about race and gender, we are talking about all children.
I understand. I understand. What happens is... I can do the math here, but to avoid the American tendency to divide.
Well, I mean, I think the tendency, which I really think, I mean, it is for gender to mean women and race to mean black. Because when I realized that psychology was about all men, that the studies of adulthood were studies of men and the studies of adolescence were studies of boys, and that that was the most gendered psychology I'd ever seen, but it wasn't called gendered. Now, it's true, when women's voices came in, suddenly gender became an issue, because before that, male was human. There was no seam between those two, and women had to be, case back, we had to be selfless and learn how, to see the world as if, we were in the position of the people whose view of the world had been socially constructed as reality. And the institutions that put that construction into place and held it in place were, the educational system and, centrally, who defined what is true. So, when Cornel talks about the passion for truth, that means that the ability really to go underneath something that has been constructed as true, but that from, like in the bones of your own experience, this isn't true. When Toni Morrison in The Bluest Eye, she starts with the school primer and it says, this is the house, and this is the family, and this is the mother, and this is the father. And it's like, that's not my house. It's not my family. That's not what my mother's like. And you can just see the alienation right there. And that person has to, in one sense or another, drop out of school because there's no connection between their experience and what's being presented as reality in school. And what we saw in our work with girls is as girls come to adolescence, and they become initiated into all the ologies, all the ways of seeing that we teach on the secondary and university level. I mean, they were saying, I'm losing my reality, because what they knew from experience, there was an experience-reality split. And they resisted it because there was enough passion for truth, and they would say, but, that wonderful beginning of Virginia Woolf, Room of One's Own, but you may say, they interrupted the conversation. People said, don't interrupt.
Let me invite members of the audience to come up to the microphones. We have 4 microphones around the room. Please come up and don't be shy. Dr. Gilligan, the one development, public schools for girls only. Is that a good thing? California, New York? Well,
I'm just saying that girls have to interrupt. That's what to pick up, that the interruption is, in a sense, to make a bigger truth. A truth that includes rather than a truth. And so the question is, how do you support girls' strength? How do you join girls' resilience? I mean, we all know who are involved with schools that most of the school services go to young boys in the elementary school age because boys are much more psychologically at risk than girls in the elementary school years. They have more learning problems, we all know that. They have more out of control and out of touch behavior. Because I think boys are under pressure in our patriarchal culture as little boys to kind of put on a veneer of toughness over their humanity and to, you know, not feel what they feel and not reveal aspects of themselves that somehow feel like
because they're supposed to separate.
They're supposed to separate from their inner world and everything associated with it, which means including women. So then you start seeing, I mean, boys resist this too. There's resistance in all children. But that's when you start seeing problems in schools. But girls are resilient until adolescence when they're suddenly under this kind of pressure. So it's really important to join girls' resilience and resistance. But then what I find in my work is it's joining it's often joining a passionate and brilliant voice in young girls, young women. And that does interrupt what's been, over the millennia, basically a conversation that hasn't included women's experience.
So that's a yes?
That's a yes.
You're in favor of public schools?
No, you see, no, that isn't a yes. So whatever is effective in supporting girls at this juncture, not to, in a sense that continues their hope that they can be included and present in the conversation, I'd say yes to that. And I think right now we're looking for what works. You know, what are the strategies for joining girls' resilience so that it strengthens and develops? We could try girls' schools. We can try truly co-educational schools. And I think there should be a lot of experimentation right now around this to find out, you know,
so
I don't think we know that one way, and it may be.
So you'd say try it.
I'd say try it, and I don't think there's one way for all girls.
This is the reporter trying to get you down to a soundbite, you know.
Try it. That's the soundbite. Try it.
Now,
it sounds like a slogan, doesn't it? Sell things.
Dr. West, Detroit tried to start a school just for black boys. Is that a good idea? Public school?
Well, just for black folks sounds like most public schools in the inner cities. But I think the real challenge is we want quality.
Right.
Quality over kind, quality over type. That means quality teachers, quality schools in terms of building, and we need quality community and quality family. Education is inseparable from family, community, supportive networks, and resources. Now, see, this issue of resources
most of
the
groups that are in Penn, part of the public education network, gets significantly less in the way of resources than other public schools.
Well, I think
it's a fact. That's part of
there's something else that comes in here too, and it's another way gender comes into this conversation, which is education also boils down finally to relationships, and you need to have teachers who are passionately committed to what they're doing, what they're teaching, or else, frankly, it doesn't matter what kind of schools. That, you know, you can't have children engaged if teachers aren't. So then I think that some of the sense of trying different things is where you can have adults, teachers and parents and the community all engaged in the learning of the school and willing to, you know.
And of course, schools are a big part of the problem. I mean, I was in an elementary school the other day, and there were slogans all over the wall about let's get together, let's be nice to each other, let's, boys and girls, let's, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Came time for recess, and teacher said, okay, let's go to recess. Girls line up over there, boys line up over there. It was like the major message was, you're different, you go play over there. I don't know, it's like in the structure.
Right, right.
Take a question. We ought to start with the president of Penn.
Actually, it's not a question. I guess I'm
Would you please identify yourself?
My name is Wendy Purifoy, and I'm president of the Public Education Network. And part of the frustration I'm experiencing in this conversation is that we want to separate, and we have done this in this conference by saying gender, race, and student achievement. We don't yet have a language, and what you two are displaying here is a level of complexity that is bringing these two issues together, is intertwined. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to really try to hear the way the two of you are bringing those two issues together. Because the public, and we as part of the public, are prepared always to deal with gender separate from race. Now, we need to look at it in some ways inside of schools to see what's happening. But we also need to create a language in which it comes together. So it's my hope that the two of you will have a moment to comment here about what you want to see as a way of bringing these two issues together, because I think it's hard to do so.
Dr. West?
Yeah, Wendy, appreciate that difficult question. And thank you for your visionary leadership of this organization, too. I mean, for me, it's twofold. On the one hand, we need a language of a democratic public institutions, at the same time a language of individuality. Then when we talk about race and gender, we're talking about particular aspects of distinctive and unique individuals who are shaped in communities. So there's a certain kind of language of the human linked to individuality, democratic publics, that allow us to keep track of those things that have impeded and obstructed the development of individuality and the fostering of democratic publics, namely these vicious legacies of white and male supremacy and vast economic inequality. So that, for me, if we're going to be able to cut through and find that kind of common ground that's so necessary without downplaying the weight of race and gender, I mean, America has a 13th Amendment, right? That's pretty weighty in relation to race. Got a 19th Amendment. Women to vote, pretty weighty. They don't have that for ethnic groups. They don't have that for religious groups, even though there's been discrimination against Catholic brothers and sisters and Jewish brothers and sisters. But when you talk about race and gender, you're talking about something that is of immense gravity that the democracy as a whole has had to wrestle with. But can we sustain a language of democratic public and individuality while talking about race and gender so that they're not divided into a kind of either-or, in an either-or manner? That's the challenge, and I think we're just in the embryonic stages of it.
Carol, comment? Shall we take a question?
Just a short comment. I'm realizing, I mean, the more I really also very much appreciate your challenge to us to take that next step, Wendy. And I'm thinking it's almost, I think of it like two eyes. I mean, if I focus on race, I stop seeing gender. It's like losing vision in one eye or something. If I focus on gender, do I have to stop seeing race? It's so out of touch with reality, that split, that it really makes me dizzy now that I get into it, because I can't do it. I mean, I can't look at gender, women and men, and, you know, the sort of all performance ways people can perform their sense of being a gendered person without seeing race. And I can't see race without seeing gender. So I think you're right, we need some word. And maybe the way Cornel's going is we have to talk about, you would talk about inequality. I would talk about voicelessness. I mean, I would talk about, I think race and gender have been ways of sort of highlighting at this time in our history how many people in our midst are without voices. I mean, without the capacity, you know, to speak and be heard. I mean, with that, we all as humans, we have a voice, and people whose voices have been shut out for the sole reason that they're black or of color or yellow or red, or they're women or they're gays or lesbian, as if that's not a human voice or it's not a voice that we, whoever we are, take seriously and listen to. I think when we talk about race and gender, we're talking about voicelessness.
That's fascinating, because you think of democracy, rule of the demos, the rule of the people, the voiced people. And those who are voiceless then are outside of the democratic circle.
And 43% of the people voted in the last election. Yeah.
Well, the other thing about the last election, though, is this was, the last two elections, it has been the women's vote that has elected the president. And I really think...
But it's that huge group, you know, well over 50%.
Well, you don't know. Maybe it would be a landslide if the rest of them... I mean,
no, but they didn't use their voice. They didn't
use their voice.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is I think we're in a period of enormous opportunity, but also, I mean, it's an interesting, almost sea change time, because now, how many years after the 19th Amendment, I mean, giving women an effective public voice is really starting to make a difference politically, and that means a sea change in this society.
And by voice, for me, I don't mean in elections. I mean,
I understand that. But
workplace,
an emblem,
culture,
yeah.
exactly, right across the board.
Just doing that.
If we could just say something about education, if women really who have been closest to the care of children take an effective voice in terms of education in this country politically, I think we'll see a lot of change.
Like your question. Yeah, would you identify yourself, please?
Henry Kelly from Atlanta, Georgia, with Apple Corps. My question centers around a lot of debate about standards on a local level and nationally as it relates to ways to improve student achievement. And I'm interested in hearing what our speakers would have to say about this debate on standards.
Yeah, for me, it strikes me as what I expect more and more out of the Clinton administration, which is a kind of sugar-coated response to a very deep problem. And what I mean by that is this, that if we're going to give public education high priority, let it be reflected in our budget. Let it be reflected in the resources that flow, not in a dialogue about standards that are decoupled from and severed from significant resources. And so you sugarcoat it and make it look as if you're so concerned, but when you actually come to make the hard decision, the resources, that defense budget receives so much more and education receives so much little, or so much less, as it were, you see. So in a way, it's kind of a subterfuge for me. And I think it's disheartening, because I think that anybody who came to this nation and looked at the state of most of our public schools would say it's a national disgrace. And to have a debate about standards when you've got the decrepit schools, the motivational structures of more and more students shattered because they're not excited about what is presented, where the life of the mind seems to be cut off completely, and run the mass culture as a way of being stimulated. That's a slide down the slope of anarchy and chaos in the end. So that I believe that structures play a role, but to make this kind of fetish of it that I see out of the White House is just another example of lack of leadership, essentially.
Dr. Gilligan, standards?
Well, I think you make a terrific point about what about standards for what schools should look like. I mean, what school buildings should be like, and what the school day should be like, and standards for how we actually treat people who work in schools, and are they really given the proper dignity that many cultures give to teachers, so that teachers are really honored and appreciated. But the other question about standards is you always have to say whose standards. And where do these standards come from? It's like, whose rules? Because standards can be a way of reinforcing and, again, shutting out and making it very difficult for people really to know what they know. So I think it's a very tricky thing.
The question of building standards, I was in a school in New Orleans not too long ago where they didn't have enough power coming into the school to run the computers. A teacher who wanted to do it had to come to school early. All the kids had to come to school early, and she would snake extension cords from a couple of other rooms so she would have enough power for a half hour so the kids could use the computers. As soon as the other teachers came in and turned on their lights, the computers went dim. And they were, I mean, they're arguing about let's wire this school. And it is hypocritical on that level. And there are a lot of schools like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we let's talk about standards in that and have that be the conversation.
Let's take a question, yes.
My name is Paul Revel. I'm with the Pew Forum at Harvard, and I'm also with the Alliance for Education in Worcester, Massachusetts. We spent the past couple of days of this conference not only examining these complex issues of race and gender, but also thinking about strategies for how we can do better, how we can rectify our poor track record in public education in these areas, and to the end of whether you call it standards or student achievement, significantly raising student achievement for all children who are in schools. And obviously one of the key players in this, in the future of education are going to be the teachers. And I'm curious about your prescriptions through the lenses with which you've been viewing the discussion today for what is appropriate, what is the appropriate way to be selecting and training and supporting our teachers so that we're more effective, not only in addressing the issues of race and gender, but in advancing student achievement for all students.
Teachers. Now you're going to get in trouble.
Well, I'll start because I'll talk about teachers, and I don't know, you probably know the figures. What are the percentages of women who are teachers now?
It's in the 90s.
What?
Depends which level you're
Elementary school.
Elementary, it's overwhelming.
So we have a very gendered teaching force. And in fact, the structure of education is often a lot of women in the teaching and then men in the administration. So it's sort of like a patriarchal household. You know, now the question is particularly these women who are teachers in classrooms often are not treated as adults. They don't have access to a telephone often. I mean, just very things that adults assume, so they're treated in a way. The first thing I would do in terms of, if I were interested in student achievement, is I would look at the teachers, and particularly I'd look at the women teachers, and do they have an effective voice in terms of making the decisions about, you know, what they're teaching, how it should be taught, because if you have a woman teaching who herself has, in a sense, is disassociated, is absent from herself, then she cannot be effective, you know, in terms of teaching girls to encourage them to bring out their voices, because whatever she's saying explicitly, she's modeling for them kind of strategy of voicelessness or, you know, not being present. So again, it was amazing to me to see girls observe women teachers and, you know, notice, for example, that when there were disagreements that the women often gave in because that was the nature of the whole structure. So that was the education to girls, that when there's a disagreement, you know, always give in. And if a teacher, a woman teacher, actually spoke out for herself, the girls celebrated that. You know, if she stood for what she truly believed, this is not just speaking out or just sounding off, but, you know, really working from a position of integrity. For example, a teacher teaching what she believes is important to know. So how you articulate that conversation within the school system among teachers, given our very gendered teacher force, it seems to me absolutely crucial for girls' education.
So concretely, what do you do?
Well, I'll tell you something concretely. If you provide a resonant space where girls can speak in the school and you begin to amplify their voices, which is what our research did, it starts to resonate with the women teachers. And they start, we did this work in the Boston Public Schools. As a matter of fact, that's where I met Wendy Purifoy. She was at the Boston Foundation, and she encouraged this work before she then, you know, came to Public Education Network, to work with the teachers. And we did a project called Women Teaching Girls, Girls Teaching Women, Women Teaching Girls, of how girls, in a sense, awakened in women teachers, in a sense, the reason and the commitment and the devotion that led them to go into teaching. But as they started to move to be good teachers to all their students, that led to structural changes in the school system. And it meant real change. I mean, it made trouble. That's, again, what gets me into trouble is, you know, having real integrity. I mean, speaking from that position.
Structural change, meaning what? I mean, telephones for the, I mean, I really want some concrete stuff.
Concrete stuff for
telephones for teachers, a voice in the curriculum. I mean,
teachers being, yes, right, treated as adult, a voice in the curriculum. Concrete changes were, for example, when teachers form teaching relationships that allow them to effectively work together, that they're not capriciously moved from one school to another, so you can't care about the kids or you can't form relationships with colleagues and develop an effective community. Or teachers supported so that there can be real discussion in classrooms and real disagreement, which can arouse strong feelings, and teachers feeling that they can have in the school day people. I mean, the search for truth is not easy. It's passionate. There's real disagreement. There are strong feelings involved in education. And there's a way in which we've sort of sanitized schools, so teachers who are both able to, prepared to, educated to, and can support that when it comes up in the classroom. And what they found was there was a life that came into the education. And I mean, the psychological effects were, you know, teachers stopped having migraine headaches or stopped, you know, all the symptoms.
In my own experience, I think it's very important because, one, we have to affirm the heroic teachers who are out there struggling against the odds. That was true when I was coming up. It's true now. The question becomes, can this country undergo a moral and political awakening that elevates the status of teachers and recognize how indispensable they are for the future of the country? That's reflected in resources. That's reflected in how they're perceived. And not only that, you have to have teachers who can move smoothly and comfortably from school to family to community. Because again, when we talk about education, we're not talking about schooling only. We're talking about how young souls are shaped. And those souls are shaped in school, they're shaped in family, they're shaped in church and mosque and synagogue and temple and basketball field, ballet, dancing and so forth. All of these aspects. If you have teachers who are compartmentalized, they don't have access to these things.
And they don't have power. I mean, in many ways, teachers have the worst of all worlds because the only power they have is over their kids. They don't have power over the curriculum.
But
they don't
that's
have power
just
over their own day. I mean, so you would say you got to read.
But that's part of elevating
that and value them.
A teacher who doesn't have power, you know, how does he or she then, I mean, in a sense, teach children to have power and to use power well? because having power then raises the question of how to use
So
power.
when he asks you what to do about teachers, you say it's not teachers, you've got to do something about the way it's organized.
Well, a lot of it has to do with how teachers are taught.
Yeah.
A lot of it has to do with the salaries of teachers. A lot of it has to do with the relation of teacher to student, teacher to the community of
But
the
out of
student.
curiosity,
and so forth.
are teachers ahead of the curve? I mean, are they in the same category as real estate salesmen and life insurance salesmen?
In
Are
which
teachers
way?
consciously better able to make the kinds of changes that you want, as opposed to, you know, people who run delis, some other group of people? I'm just curious.
My experience was, as I said, I mean, my experience was of going into a school and there was kind of waking up.
So the teachers, you think they'd be ready?
Oh,
That's what the
absolutely. That
question
was my experience. And then what I also felt, though, was I touched the edge of fear on the part of the teachers, that if they actually started to make changes, there was an enormous amount of fear. And I would love to understand what that fear was about.
You know what it is? It's fear of letting go of something before you got the other thing in your hand. You know, the devil you know kind of thing.
Yeah.
Isn't that?
I think that may be
No,
part of it, but I'm
I
not...
think it's fear of recognizing that what is at stake in the lives of these children is so immense, and yet you have so little to bring to it, even given your hope to want to do so much about it. And that is a very, very frightening situation to put anybody in. And then they become oftentimes the scapegoats of the society, because they are then pointed to when the kids are out of control. They're pointed to when the kids don't achieve, and yet the low priorities reflected in the larger society put them in a situation that in some senses is disillusioning, and yet so many still continue to struggle. I think that they in so many ways are real heroes.
Are real heroes. Yeah. Let's take a question, please. Identify yourself, if you would.
Harry Spence, Deputy Chancellor for Operations for the New York City Board of Education. Mr. West talked about the power of the commercial culture in reinforcing all of the existing hierarchies, and I assume Ms. Gilligan would agree with that concern. Sort of historically, the major answer to that has been to mobilize the power of the state. That seems to have produced some horrendous distortions in places that have led us to conclude that that doesn't work. And so we're kind of at a loss, it seems to me, about the question about how we mobilize alternatives or resistance to that. We're left really with individual level ways of intervening or resisting. So I guess the question would be, what are some larger scale ways of mobilizing to resist what is so powerful and in fact now presumably a force that we've sort of surrendered wholly to?
It's a tough question. One, I don't think we can ever give up on the state. Simply because the state producing distorted programs doesn't mean you give up. You simply go back and try to ensure that those programs are less bureaucratized, that they're more service-oriented, and that they actually relate more effectively with the kids. But on the other hand, we have to be creative. And of course, in American society, the most stable institutions are corporate institutions for a variety of reasons. You know, it's a capitalist society, it's corporate sector of the economy, it's the strongest sector, and so forth. They have most of the resources, most of the wealth, and so on. So we have to relate to our corporate friends in a critical way. It's to say, you also are citizens, that your future is tied to mine. Your future is tied to the kids, brown, black, red, and so on. And we want money not simply to produce these kids as a labor force for your corporation, but as citizens. So there's a critical cutting edge there. And we come as citizens. We don't come as brokers of 10 Commandments and you have all the money. That's a very different kind of relation. It's hard for corporations to understand that. Some do, some don't. But it has to be a creative partnership, but we cannot give up on the state. We can't give up on the city, we can't give up on the state, can't give up on federal monies, even given the neoconservative attack on the various programs, some of which worked, some of which did not. That's always going to be the case in anything you do.
Reaction? Let's take a question then. Yes, please. Would you identify yourself?
Yes, Janice Weinman, Executive Director of the American Association of University Women. As we enter the 21st century, the electronic voice seems to be overtaking the human voice. And both in the home and in schools, technology is separating the haves from the have-nots and girls from boys. I wonder if you could comment on how technology could be used as a tool to bring genders and races together rather than separating them apart.
Well, one, I think we should always view technology as inseparable from the class hierarchy in place. Technology never floats all by itself. It's under the auspices of capital. It's under the auspices of corporate power. Now, at the same time, it will shift and change that corporate power, and therefore it can accentuate the inequality, as it were. But it's never technology in and of itself.
It's value-laden.
It's value-laden, and it's institutionally inseparable from corporate entities, as it were. The challenge becomes, okay, how then do we create possibilities for technology such that democratic possibilities are accented rather than simply financial ones or corporate ones, as it were. And I think that here we have to ensure that not only ought every child to have access to the technology, but the very way in which technology is created at the workplace, at the sites of innovation, ensure that citizens across the board, all colors, all classes, are in on that innovation.
How are we doing so far? I mean, the games are about as boy-driven as you can get.
You see the patriarchy recycling in the electronic voice. You see the racist bombardment. I mean, you look at television and look at films and so forth. The same stereotypes that we had in the 19th century of black women and black men and red women and Asians and so forth and so on. If those voices were there to help produce the product, that's what democracy is about. Even under conditions of high levels of technology, it might be different. I think more likely, it very well may be different.
Dr.
Well, I think I'm thinking also about the question of voice that you raised. Of what difference does it make when you don't have the physical voice present, and this sense of speaking to somebody who you don't see and you can't hear. And that cuts out a lot of information about the person. I mean, one of the ways of knowing if somebody is, real or not trustworthy or not is to kind of watch their face and listen to their voice. So it takes away a lot of cues for the way in which we can begin to kind of find our way through the world.
People, when they say technology, often mean computers, but the most hopeful use of technology I've ever seen in this light is when kids are given power over the video,
right,
and the chance to make their own videos, to make just even PSAs, public service announcements. And it's surprising because adults say, well, they'll probably make them about violence or this and that, but there was one group of, and the PSA that most of them made had to do with getting together with their families. It was a message to their mom or their dad, talk to me. But that gives a voice, and it's the control of the technology. She mentioned the 21st century. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Is the problem of the 21st century for America likely to be the problem of the color line?
Certainly will be one of the problems, no doubt. Du Bois also wrote in 1935, the problem of the 20th century is the color line, labor, and the challenge of gender. In the 21st century, it will be color line, labor, and the challenge of gender. Sexual orientation as well, the physical handicap. So that
are we making any progress? Are we solving any problems?
Oh, sure, we made some progress. I mean, we're sitting here, nobody wants to chop our necks off. That's a struggle for rights and liberties and so forth. The problem is that the progress that we do make is so subject to regress. So when you look at the quality of public education in the United States, you see, you've had major progress on the one hand, we've had significant regress at the same time. History swings in this pendulum, as it were.
We have time for a couple more questions. Yes, go ahead. Would you identify yourself, please?
Beth Dilley, I'm from Grand Rapids, Michigan. It strikes me that both of you are great teachers. It is part of what you do in your daily lives. And I wonder if you could comment on what the quality, whether it's at home, whether it's in our churches and synagogues, whether it's in our classrooms, what is the quality of the nature of that relationship? I mean, if we're really trying to find the truth about race or gender or class or just sort of how we walk in the world, can you make some comments on what is the quality, what does that relationship look like? Whether it's parent, child, teacher, learner, brother, sister, I mean, what's the culture we want to set up to do this from?
Well, it's interesting because it's intrinsically a relationship of difference. And it's a perfect, in a way, it's a perfect example to bring into this conversation, because it's by virtue of the difference that these, two people really educate each other, or can enliven or deaden each other, parent, child, teacher, student. And a good relationship, a teacher and a student, is one where both learn differently, but yet it's undertaken, for the purpose of the teacher, I think really, I would say awakening, but I would say listening to and hearing kind of where's the edge of that student, and that would, connect to the world in a way that would lead further, where you can perhaps see certain ways in which this person could move further. I know, for example, in my own work with students, I often listen to where's the creative voice, where's the brilliant voice, where's the real question, and then provide resonance for that, join that, so it gets louder. But then I learn, because their questions are often different from what would my questions be. And, okay.
But I would say distinctive feature is empathy. And by empathy, I mean care, respect for the other, which gives others the benefit of being wrong because you take them so seriously, and challenge, unsettling them, letting them know they are accountable to something outside of them. If you confuse care, respect, and challenging students, you're going to have a good time teaching.
We have time for perhaps one more question. Yes, sir.
Jerry Baum from Baltimore. If you could be an elementary school principal with substantial discretionary authority, do you have a sense of what you might change, what you might do differently to integrate gender, race, and student achievement?
If I were an elementary school principal, I'd focus on the boys in the K-1-2 period and see this as a crucial time for joining them, and that would be a crisis time to join their, to focus on the teaching of them. I'd put a lot of resources there. I'd put a lot of my attention to girls in the 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And I would be aware that gender's operating all the time in that sense in my school, and that there are different risks and different times of risks, and then think very deeply about how to join the most deeply human qualities, including the curiosity and the love of learning and the search for truth in those age groups.
Dr. West?
I would tell my students and staff and teachers that we are constituting a counterculture here at this school. And it's over against the dominant culture of the market, of the egoism and the individualism and hedonism and narcissism. We're creating a space here that will shape citizens for a new democracy. And the shaping of those citizens will be reflected in curriculum, reflected in how we relate to one another. It'll be reflected in the vision for the school. And when you leave the school, you'll know things are a little different. And you can't wait to get back, because this counterculture will produce levels of joy and pleasure and excitement that go far beyond the MTVs of the world.
That's a great answer.
There would, however, be a possibility that you'd be working somewhere else the next year.
This is true. I need some friends as well.
But I think we are pretty much out of time. I'd like a one word from each of you on what to do tomorrow. What do you want the people who are paying attention to this to do tomorrow about this problem?
Don't give in to despair. Keep your hopes up. There's been moments in which teaching and public education have been down and out, and it has bounced back, and it will bounce back if we can fight hard enough.
I would say also, keep up the hope. I think also remember that we are in the middle of a huge social transformation now, and to join the hopeful side of it, the forward side of it, and realize that as teachers and educators, you have the future in your hands, and it's such deep work that you do every day. You're basically shaping the future of this country.
I would like to thank I know you will join me in thanking the Public Education Network for creating this forum. And I would like to also say that those of you who may have missed some of this or would like to hear Drs. Gilligan and West again, you can catch it on National Public Radio on the Merrill Report. Check local listings, as they say. And let me ask all of you to join me in thanking Dr. Gilligan, Dr. Cornel.
That was nice, yeah.
Well, this is a fitting end to our conference, but it's just the beginning. We could go on, could hear it in your voices that there is much more territory to cover than we were able to do in this closing plenary. But to sit with Cornel West and Carol Gilligan is to really have your consciousness shifted, to think in new ways, and to actually have your blood course through your veins in a different way. We do have different voices, and we are unique, and we are also Democrats and Americans. So, thank you very much. This closes our annual conference. Travel well, travel safely. Look to hear from us in the mail. We'll do this again next year, as we do every year. We will be celebrating the 15th anniversary of the founding members of the Public